Sunday night on BBC1, the Antiques Roadshow team unearth the weird and wonderful at 7:15.
Isn't that incredible?
And at 8, there are new faces in Ballykiss Angel, some more welcome than others. Morecambe and Wise at 10 to 9 are feeling creative.
I'm going to write a musical this afternoon, if it rains.
At 9:20, a helping hand arrives just in time for Ivanhoe.
Let go your hold on me, sir.
If you let go your hold on me.
Gripping stuff for Sunday night on BBC1.
Society today is making ever greater strides to get mothers back to work. From nursery care to children's hotels. But what if by going to work you were damaging your children's education? What then?
We found that when mothers were working, children were doing less well in school.
Research is discovering the effect that full-time working can have on your child when it needs you most.
Mothers are key figures for education talk.
Missing Mum, Panorama, tomorrow 9:30 BBC1.
Songs of praise crossing boundaries of age, culture and faith in 25 minutes when Steve Chalk joins the congregation in Highbury, North London. Now on BBC1, the news at 5:45 this Sunday evening with Paul Burden.
The government has been coming under pressure to explain its plans for the privatisation of the London Underground. A leaked report suggests that income from the sell-off will be much less than originally suggested. The deselected Tory MP, Sir George Gardiner, claims he will be reinstated. Party leaders have appealed to him to accept his fate. And thousands marched through Londonderry to remember the victims of Bloody Sunday 25 years ago. Good evening. The government estimates that the proposed privatisation of the London Underground may raise only £600 million. That's well below previous estimates of its market value. The Transport Secretary, Sir George Young, is refusing to comment on the reports. But leaked cabinet documents seen by the BBC suggest that the government wants to bring forward the announcement of the privatisation plans to gain maximum political advantage in the run-up to the general election.
The leaked memo, apparently written after the Cabinet met at Chequers to discuss the Tory manifesto, admits that tube privatisation will be unique and very difficult to sell to the public. Nevertheless, it seems Sir George Young believes it can be a vote winner, and an announcement is expected in the next 2 weeks. The Transport Secretary's memo outlines a range of options, from selling the tube as a single business to splitting it up along the lines of rail privatisation. This morning, Sir George would only confirm that a study was underway.
On London Underground, the position is we are seeing whether the real improvements we're seeing on the railways can be applied to London Underground. The important thing is to get that decision right and not rush it.
The memo says the London Underground could fetch between £1.2 and £2 billion. An extra government subsidy of £600 million would be needed for investment. The sale proceeds would be ploughed back into the network, and safety would remain the top priority. The opposition parties aren't impressed.
Clearly, it's another fix on privatisation. What you end up doing is that they make a great political play about it, and then it costs you, the taxpayer, an awful lot more, like rail privatisation.
Transport experts say putting a price on London Underground won't be easy.
Well, London Underground is a liability and not an asset. They do earn some profit on their operations, but against that you have to set a very substantial liability to make good the investment which has been allowed to lapse in the past.
So tube privatisation looks likely to be an election issue, but whoever wins will be told that billions of pounds need to be spent on improving the network, and either main party would turn to the private sector for at least some of that cash. Rory Kathleen-Jones, BBC News at London Underground headquarters.
The deselected Conservative MP, Sir George Gardiner, is coming under renewed pressure to give up plans to stand in his Reigate constituency at the next election. The leader of the Tories' backbench committee, Sir Marcus Fox, has warned him he'll do considerable damage to his own colleagues if he stands against the Conservative candidate chosen to succeed him.
From the moment Sir George Gardiner was sacked as Reigate's Tory candidate for disloyalty to the Prime Minister, the right-wing Eurosceptic has refused to go quietly. He wants to win back his party's endorsement, but local Conservatives and colleagues at Westminster are more worried that he may go it alone. In an article in today's Mail on Sunday, he says it's up to the voters, not those he calls the toffee-nosed tendency in Reigate, to choose their MP. His Tory backbench chairman has appealed to him to think again.
If he looks at the history book, it's not a good story in terms of people who, for whatever reason, have decided to leave the party or been forced to, if they try and battle it out on their own. And don't forget, he will be doing considerable damage to a number of his old colleagues.
His allies want to rerun the selection or even go to court. Sir George says he's taking legal advice, but one leading ally is qualifying her support.
I have told him categorically if he stood as an independent, I would not support him. As the official candidate, I would, and I have every confidence he will be the next Conservative official candidate for this constituency.
The Foreign Secretary in Davos for the World Economic Forum has added his voice to those looking to Sir George to back down.
Been obviously a very difficult time for him. It must have been quite a shock, the result. I think he needs time to reflect on what is in his best interest and in the interests of the party of which he is a member.
There's gloom at Tory headquarters about a battle over Europe that's being fought on several fronts. Tory strategists had drafted a selection of phrases, all of them hostile towards a European currency, for use by Eurosceptic candidates wanting to qualify their party's wait-and-see approach to monetary union. The battle between Sir George Gardiner and his enemies in Reigate has gone too far to be glossed over. Some Tories are hoping he'll back down rather than risk humiliation on election night. But either way, the damage from this latest skirmish in the civil war over Europe has already been done. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
The French President Jacques Chirac says he's impressed by the speed of Boris Yeltsin's recovery from his latest illness. Mr. Chirac described the Russian president as in good form after meeting him for talks near Moscow. Mr. Yeltsin developed pneumonia 3 weeks ago after his recent heart bypass operation. Martin Sixsmith reports.
It was a much stronger-looking Boris Yeltsin who came to greet the French president, turning to check the thermometer, an icy 14 degrees below zero, but deciding he was fit enough to brave the cold. His reward was an expansive greeting from Mr. Chirac, designed to show Western support for the beleaguered Russian leader and a strong arm to lean on as they went inside for talks. Showing more confidence than on recent occasions and with his voice nearly back to the booming tones of old, Mr. Yeltsin spoke of the friendly nature of the meeting, but he didn't duck the thorny issue of Russian opposition to NATO expansion into Eastern Europe.
I'm ready for discussions on all issues that are of interest to our countries, including European security and the question of NATO.
Later, Mr. Chirac said he now hoped for accord on NATO expansion before final decisions are taken next July.
President Yeltsin was well informed about the problems of the world and very tough in defence of Russia's interests. I was impressed by the speed of his recovery.
For Boris Yeltsin, this has been a welcome return to the international stage. Further, tougher tests clearly lie ahead. But today's performance will be reassuring for those here and in the West who look to Mr. Yeltsin to provide continuity and stability in Russia. Martin Sixsmith, BBC News, Moscow.
There are reports from Algeria that 31 people have been killed in the town of Medea. Islamic militants are being blamed for the attack, which is part of a pattern of increasing violence against civilians. More than 300 people have been killed in the last month. The President of Pakistan has called on voters in tomorrow's general election to choose a government that can take the country in a new direction. The election was called by Farouk Leghari after he dismissed Benazir Bhutto's 3-year-old government on charges of corruption and maladministration, charges which she disputes.
Requisition buses take election workers out to the polling stations for tomorrow's voting. The 4th time Pakistanis are being called on to choose a new government in less than 10 years. At the polling stations themselves, this one is only for women, final preparations for a voting process made more complicated because new assemblies for the 4 provinces are being elected at the same time. If Benazir Bhutto is now fighting for her political life after seeing her government dismissed, her supporters were doing everything to make her still look like a winner as she ended her campaign. But it was Nawaz Sharif, industrialist and also a former Prime Minister, who seemed to be heading more confidently on the road to victory. He says tackling Pakistan's crippled economy would be his priority. Although Imran Khan is expected to end up with no more than a handful of seats at most, his first campaign has helped to highlight the corruption issue. In a broadcast tonight, President Laghari said Pakistan had been plundered through corruption, waste and inefficiency. He promised a free, fair and transparent election. It will be the most observed election in Pakistan's history. This Commonwealth team is led by the former Australian Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser. It's now the 55 million voters of Pakistan who will give the politicians perhaps the greatest test of accountability they've had to face here. How many bother to go to the polls will be telling in itself. Mike Wooldridge, BBC News, Islamabad.
The environmental group Friends of the Earth says a new report it commissioned on plans to bury nuclear waste in Cumbria shows that there is a danger of radioactive contamination leaking out. There are increasing doubts about the plans of the company Nirex to build an underground research facility at the site.
All the reports raise serious doubts about whether radioactive waste could safely be stored underground here in Cumbria without leaking. One new report by the independent environment consultants Aspinalls for Friends of the Earth says radioactive waste could rise to the surface.
Nirex's safety case is fundamentally flawed. There is every chance that radioactivity from a nuclear dump would leak direct to the surface and contaminate the public water system.
Nirex has started drilling on the site, but a former Nirex consultant says its calculations on the potential safety are too simplistic. Today's Independent on Sunday reports the government's own pollution inspectors have already questioned safety. And in a leaked memo, Nirex's own head of science, John Holmes, admits there are problems, in stark contrast to previous statements, according to a former government advisor.
The impression that we were repeatedly getting was that the safety case would be proven to be acceptable. We, on the other hand, were saying that we believed that it was much more difficult than Nirex was suggesting to us it would actually be.
Has Nirex changed its position now, in your opinion?
Well, Dr. Holmes appears to have changed his position.
Nirex says Sellafield in Cumbria remains its preferred site, but says it'll look elsewhere if this proves unsafe.
We don't know if the Sellafield site would be safe for the disposal of radioactive waste at all. We need more research. We need at least 4 more years research, and that's what we have applied to the Secretary of State for the Environment for Planning Permission to do.
The government's to announce any day now whether to allow Nirex to build a rock laboratory on the site in advance of the nuclear dump. With mounting pressure on the government to abandon the project, the Environment Department today confirmed it has received a number of new requests to reopen the inquiry. It's now investigating these. Margaret Gilmore, BBC News at the Department of the Environment.
The Swiss government says that resolving the row over assets deposited by Jewish victims of the Holocaust is now its principal foreign policy objective. At the World Economic Forum in Davos, the Swiss government promised to repay every penny owed to the Jewish community. In all, 3 inquiries are now underway and a fund has been established to help Jewish survivors.
The Prime Minister of Israel made plain during private discussions with the Swiss government this weekend that no further excuses are acceptable. All assets stolen from or deposited by Jewish families in the war must be returned. In the central square of the state capital Bern, banks stand on each side of the Parliament building. Swiss banks are as well known for their closeness to government as for their secrecy.
Okay, good.
But the man leading the latest government inquiry into Jewish assets says this time no stone will be left unturned.
No Swiss franc, no penny which is found in Switzerland and does not belong to Switzerland is going to stay here. We're going to give it back to the rightful owner, or we establish a fund for charities.
During the Second World War, as Jewish families were rounded up by the Nazis, many deposited funds in Switzerland. After the war, survivors who couldn't provide precise account details or death certificates of their relatives were simply turned away. Token attempts have been made before to trace the accounts of Holocaust victims, but when the government last demanded an investigation, only 26 of the country's 500 banks responded. For Switzerland's small Jewish community, loyalties have been painfully divided. Michael Cohen is critical of the bank's insensitivity and their obsessive secrecy, but he now urges moderation on both sides.
We are a tiny community devoted to the Jewish cause, and of course we would like and urge our government to resolve it. But on the other side, being Swiss citizens integrated in this country, we also say to our friends, the Jews all over the world, that they should be fair to the Swiss people.
Banks generate around 10% of Switzerland's considerable wealth. All sides now agree banks and government must act swiftly to refute allegations that they're hoarding billions of pounds that belongs to the Jewish community.
Under massive international pressure, the ledgers of the Swiss banks are finally being prized open. The tragedy is that it's taken more than half a century. Too late for many relatives of the Holocaust victims who will have died before their money is returned. Peter Morgan, BBC News in Zurich.
Dunolly is the new favourite for the Cheltenham Gold Cup after an impressive victory in the Irish Hennessy Gold Cup at Leopardstown. Ridden by Tommy Tracy, he led for most of the race and held off a spirited challenge by the British chaser Jadami, who pulled up lame and will miss the rest of the season. Tony O'Hare describes the closing stages.
And racing up to the line, Dunolly getting a huge reception as they go to the line. Dunolly, Jadami still coming, but Dunolly's holding him as they go to the line. Dunolly wins the Hennessy Gold Cup. Tommy Tracy punches the air with delight.
And in the FA Carling Premiership, a hat-trick by Alan Shearer earned Newcastle a 4-3 win over Leicester at St James's Park. Newcastle had taken an early lead after Robbie Elliott latched on to a loose ball in the penalty area in the 4th minute. But 10 minutes into the second half, Matt Elliott levelled with a far post header. Steve Claridge put Leicester ahead shortly afterwards, poking the ball past Hislop on the hour. Emil Heskey's superb solo effort looked to put the game beyond Newcastle's reach in the 68th minute. But then Alan Shearer produced a superb free kick in the 77th. Second shortly afterwards looked enough for a point, only for him to complete a memorable match in the dying seconds. Several thousand people have marched through Londonderry to mark the 25th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, when 13 civil rights protesters were shot dead by the army. Relatives of those who died led the procession carrying white crosses. Last week, families called on the British government to set up a new inquiry into the shootings.
It's been an emotional day for the relatives of the Bloody Sunday victims. This morning they attended a wreath-laying ceremony. The events of the past few days have been geared not only to remembering the dead, but also to demanding a fresh inquiry into the killing of unarmed protesters by soldiers in 1972.
I knew many of the people who were killed, and I know that they're totally innocent people. And indeed, John Major has told me in a letter that they were innocent of being armed with either guns or bombs. Why therefore were they shot? And it's my intention now to get together all the new evidence with the families and take it directly to the Prime Minister.
Those claims of new evidence centre on allegations that some of the Bloody Sunday victims might not have been killed as previously assumed by paratroopers on the ground, but instead by other soldiers positioned on Derry's city walls. This afternoon, relatives of the dead, carrying 14 white crosses, led a march along the exact route of the parade, which ended in tragedy 25 years ago. The march was undoubtedly the biggest Bloody Sunday commemoration ever. Amongst those taking part was Gerry Adams and other Sinn Féin politicians. The parade culminated in a rally in the Bogside estate, where the controversial shootings occurred. Here, protesters made it clear that they will continue to campaign for a new inquiry into the killings until they get the full apology from the government, which they have demanded. Mark Devonport, BBC News, Derry.
And Godfrey Bazley, the creator of Britain's longest-running radio soap, The Archers, has died at the age of 92. He was the programme's first editor during the 1950s, and his family farm in the Worcestershire village of Hanbury inspired the show's setting. And that's it for now. The late news tonight will be at 10:15 here on BBC1.